Welcome to the Workplace Manager's View of the Role of Coworkers in Return to Work webinar. We're glad you're here. My name is Angie Hunt, Project Manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant programs through the BC government, as well as donations and memberships to CIRPD. While we were waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing, as well as to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted through the presentation and follow the presentation with Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within about a week, along with the slides. You'll be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they are available. As I mentioned, my name is Angie, and I'll be moderating the webinar and Q&A session. Our presenter today is Dr. Deborah Dunstan. Deborah Dunstan is an associate professor in clinical psychology and director of the postgraduate clinical psychology program at the University of New England, Armidale, Australia. She is a qualified clinical psychologist and physiotherapist and has worked in the health services sector for over 25 years. Deborah's research is in the field of rehabilitation psychology and focuses on work disability prevention and management. And now I'll hand it over to Deborah.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome from down under in Australia. It's a real delight for me to be able to be with you and to give you this presentation, which covers a number of areas of my research. You will know that we've got some learning outcomes for today, and what I'm hoping that you'll gather from this presentation is an understanding that return to work arrangements are impacted by the social context of work. And while standard arrangements work most of the time, they can be inadequate for situations that require a co-worker to support another worker in challenging situations. What I'm going to conclude is that consultation and communication with co-workers may lead to a better return to work outcome. So what I'm going to present to you initially is some information about the workplace being a social environment, and this comes from organisational psychology, where the findings are that co-workers exchanges and group adhesion impact all work outcomes, including return to work. And in a moment I'll take you to a figure that's going to illustrate that. But the fact that we know that this social context exists, it influences return to work outcomes, and we actually get hints of that in injury management documents. So for instance, the requirement to have early contact, we see statements like, this is to help the injured worker remain connected and to feel part of a team. So this has the implication of knowing that people at a workplace are in a social context. This diagram is showing you the research findings of the areas of impact of a co-worker. So in the workplace, workers, co-workers can be supportive, and their responses can range from supportive through to antagonistic. And the impact of a co-worker in a workplace does depend on a number of factors, and one of those is indeed how much interaction and support is required, and whether this is affective or emotional, or whether it's simply practical. The social intensity of the job, and that's, as I said, whether a job requires a lot of cooperation, like people working on a cut-up line in a chicken processing factory, or whether people are working in quite independent situations like me in academia or other people working in office contexts. The effect of the co-worker on outcomes also depends on the level of antagonism, whether it's low or high. So the outcomes will be based on our interactions with co-workers, how we perceive our role, what our attitude to work will be, how effective we are, how effective the organisation is, and how much we want to engage in withdrawing or just not being part of that organisation. And I'm sure most of us can look back at our own experiences and see how this has actually come out in reality, or we certainly have had experience with situations where we know that how you feel about your work, how effective you are, can be influenced by co-workers. I certainly see teams who get on really well, have a shared goal, they are highly effective and their outcomes for the organisation are highly effective. People are not looking to change jobs because they've got a good sense of team there. Other situations I've observed where there's a somewhat toxic environment, or there might just be one individual who is prickly and difficult to get on with, and that makes other people's work lives difficult. Grievances arise. Problems can then involve in trying to resolve that grievance, and a great deal of time and energy and distraction can occur. So when you've got positive relationships happening, you'll have support. When there's antagonism, then that impacts the outcomes of all of the co-workers. So that comes from organisational psychology theory. So when we return back to standard return to work arrangements, usually what we've got the employer, the injured worker, state or private insurer, and healthcare professionals who inform the return to work process of the capacities, the functional capacities the injured worker has, and any accommodations they require. So again, in standard return to work arrangements, we have strategies like maintaining contact and early return to work. And interestingly, as I said before, these initial processes reflect this understanding of trying to maintain social cohesion, but then it stops. Then we get the return to work plan and accommodations, and in Canada, like here in Australia, employers are incentivised by experience ratings on premiums to provide accommodations. And it really is this accommodations process where we start to get some difficulties with co-workers. And I'll be expanding on that as I continue. But in Australia, certainly employers' premiums are based on days lost, whether the injured worker is finally returned to work or not. And it goes to the point that employers will be fined here in addition for not providing workplace accommodations. So under all of these standard processes, however, is this assumption that there are modified duties just waiting there available to be done, that it's a straightforward process, and really it's just an interaction and negotiation between the employer and the injured worker, and they will create a situation that's been directed by the medical certification from the treating practitioners. So typically our return to work plan has some description of what the statement of the pre-injury duties, what the return to work goal is, the area of the person's injury. We have that here in Australia. Perhaps some of your jurisdictions in Canada may not even specify that. There is a documentation of the person's health recovery needs. So if they need to work part-time or they need a time off to attend physiotherapy or other appointments, that will be there. A statement of their functional abilities and of the accommodations to be provided. And what we know is actually most of the time this works quite well. However, the problems are when things don't go to plan. And research will show us that if we ask people, where that problem was or why things didn't go to plan, we'll often hear statements about it being a lack of support by the supervisor or the co-worker. And when you drill down to find out, well, what does that mean? It means that, there was a lack of care or consideration or empathy. So we start talking about social interaction issues, not just mechanistic functional issues of providing suitable duties, but actually what's going on in the social context of the workplace. So overall, it's this lack of support or problems with interpersonal interactions with co-workers. So even if the supervisor is apparently supportive, it's the interactions with the co-worker there that have created the difficulties as to why this has gone wrong. What we know from co-worker research, and some of this is research of mine and of others, and in a final slide in this presentation I give you some references where you'll be able to find the actual research supporting these points that I'm raising here. But from that research, it tells us that co-workers can have a positive or a negative impact on return to work outcomes. That in fact they are not just some standby party, that they have a crucial role and that their positive contributions lead to positive outcomes. And these positive contributions are the way they adjust what they would normally be doing to support what the injured worker needs. However, in some research that I did over in Ontario, we found that in fact return to work arrangements can be quite damaging to co-workers. And this happens in situations where in many workplaces there's not a budget line to be able to replace a worker who's off work because of a health condition or a work-related condition. And so it's left to co-workers to pick up that slack. When the injured worker is performing light duties, be they light in the form of physical or psychological demands, it means that other people have to pick up that slack. So in this other work that I've done, qualitative studies with injured workers, I've found that because injured workers had to do literally heavy lifting more often than they would normally, because the returning injured worker has, say, a 5 kilo limit on their lifting capacity. And we can translate this into psychological demands as well. So the heavier demands have fallen to the co-workers, and I heard reports of co-workers themselves sustaining an injury because they've had to do that heavier work. Or there's been disruption to their workplace causing distress. So in one situation that I was told about, an injured worker was transferred from their usual area of work, redeployed to a different area where they had really little skills for that job, which created extra work and stress for the person who was supervising them in that role. But this particular person had suffered a brain injury and had difficulty speaking. The worker also had physical signs of that injury and of being intubated when they're in an unconscious state. And this caused a great deal of uncomfortability and distress to the workplace where the person had been redeployed, or to the work area, because no information was given to this new set of co-workers about what the injury was or what had happened to the person. And so there were damaging consequences for them. And what we know in all of these situations, though, is that the co-workers are not included in any planning or discussion of the return to work process, and this is because of privacy and confidentiality issues. But indeed, they have an impact, either positive or negative, on the outcome. So I've done a study looking at what co-workers thought about their role in the return to work process. So the next one was about, well, what do managers think about co-workers' role in this return to work process? So this study involved 14 Canadian managers who had direct oversight of return to work plans, either in an HR role or directly supervisor in the work team. And this was across 3 provinces. We had people who participated. And what I did was we had one focus group, and there were otherwise individual interviews with participants. And there were open-ended questions where we were looking to understand what they thought co-workers' role was in the return to work process, how they thought they fitted within this process, what was expected of them, if they saw any challenges or opportunities, if their workplace had any particular way of engaging co-workers, and then finally, after we got through these questions, asked them what they thought it might be like from the co-worker's point of view. So this is a summary of the findings that I'm going to go on and expand for you. What we found was that certainly co-workers in every situation, co-workers had no formal role, no voice in the return to work processes, but they were certainly expected to cooperate. And by cooperation, the managers meant positive social interactions. They meant for them to be caring and compassionate and inclusive and supportive, certainly not to give people any cold shoulders or make them feel unwelcome. And this was particularly the case when a person was redeployed to an entirely new work area with an organisation. So they expected positive social interactions. What we also found was that managers had only informal processes, which they did use for difficult situations. And I'll go on to explain this, but what these difficult situations were when there was negative responses from co-workers, but they invariably came down to situations that were challenging in terms of fairness with a co-worker. We also found that managers had difficulty integrating return to work procedures with their other legal obligations like privacy and confidentiality and normal management strategies, performance management strategies that you would use for behavioural issues in a normal performance context. So I'm just going to expand on these now. So in terms of the point of return to work being found to have little relevance to co-workers, it was obvious that managers were describing the process from their stance, from a managerial or administrative perspective, which is absolutely normal to be expected, because managers understand that the return to work is a matter between themselves and the injured worker, and they have obligations to accommodate the injured worker and to assist that person to get back to work. And as I've previously flagged, there are incentives in terms of costs on premiums if this doesn't turn out that way. So the kind of comments that we heard from managers is, you know, it's about co-workers. It's a non-issue for them. They're not expected to be involved. They're never part of the process. We tell them nothing. We don't tell them anything. We just let them know that this person is coming back and these are the accommodations that will be needed, and that's it. We tell them nothing. Interestingly, when we asked the question about how co-workers might have a positive contribution, in what ways would they have a positive contribution to return to work outcomes, managers really found that hard to say. And what I saw that to be was the usual thing that we expect people to do their job. And so like all of us, we can do a really good job and no one's telling us that, hey, you're doing a great job, or maybe they are and it'd be nice if they did. But there's just an expectation that we'll do the job that we're paid to do. But we'll hear about it if we're not. And so managers just expected that co-workers would adjust what they were doing or act in a positive, socially appropriate way to ensure that the return to work outcome occurred, but they didn't see this as the positive contribution that co-workers made. But very clearly, they saw lack of co-worker support as the key reason why they got return to work outcomes, either poor outcomes, failure to return to work, taking longer than expected. So what did they expect of co-workers? Well, their view was that this was a moral duty, that people have an obligation to work cooperatively, to adjust their duties as required, that they have a requirement in the workplace to share the employer's duty to accommodate, and that they are to be supportive. There was in some cases a sense of quite a high moral ground position here. One manager saying, you know, we raise our children to be caring and helpful to others, and this is what we expect in the workplace, and this is just their duty, this is just what they have to do. So even though it's not necessarily on someone's duty statement, it is an expectation that as part of the workplace that you will help this injured worker who's being accommodated, that you'll be thoughtful, respective, compassionate, understanding. They were the kind of expectations that managers had of co-workers. But they did note in particular that there was, if there was going to be a lack of support, it would be for non-visible injuries, where there was maybe some question about the legitimacy of the injury or the validity of the complaints or the level of pain or the functional limitations made by the injured worker. If it was a mental health disorder, there were, you know, possibly problems here if the person's gone off on a psychological injury, claiming some stress-related situation in the workplace, but the person is already known to have an addiction or a history of their own mental health problems. There was also lack of support if the return to work was protracted, it went on much longer than expected or beyond the time in which, you know, most people would think recovery was reasonable, and in particular if there were pre-injury issues with this person, if there'd been conflicts or there was a lack of a goodwill. This was not surprising for me to hear this. So I'm taking you back to another model now, and this is a model that I'd put together, and it's the front half of the previous model that I've showed you, and that can be found in one of my publications that I have attached to this webinar. But in this situation, I'd reviewed the literature, and I was looking at, well, what are the factors that contribute to co-workers' support or antagonism? So as you look at this, you can see that this was the part that went on then further to the right to look at the outcomes for an employee. And what the literature told us was, going back here, was people's responses to accommodations. Now this actually comes from the literature that had examined accommodating people with traditional disabilities into the workplace. So this is rather than the acquired disability a person might have due to a work-related injury. So these are more traditional things such as intellectual disability or other physical disabilities that might come from brain injury or major injury and accident. So the type of things that were going to influence a person's response to accommodations were attributes of the ill or injured employee. Now what this meant was whether they liked the person or not, whether they this person has a good work ethic, whether this person is respected, whether this person has been around for some time, so there is a reservoir of goodwill towards that person. So generally things about the person. Then there were features of the injury, the kind of things that I already mentioned. So if this person fell over and on a wet patch in the workplace, and someone else had spilled something and they didn't mop it up and the person broke their leg, that is a perfectly acceptable injury to co-workers. But if it's an invisible injury, if it's a mental health disorder, if it's low back pain, or if it's something that they think the person actually got on the weekend when they were playing football instead of when they were lifting something in the workplace, that influences the co-worker's response to the accommodation. Also from the literature was attributes of the co-worker. What this meant is the person's sense of a fair and just world, past history of supporting accommodations, features, personality features of the co-worker. What I can tell you though, in the research that I've since done and is on its way to publication, is that did not actually impact perceptions of fairness. Attributes of the injured employee, the features of the injury, and features of the workplace. What that means is the kind of policies that the workplace has regarding management of occupational injuries, the procedures, the formalities, what everyone knows about their rights and entitlements, etc. All of those things, though, were mediated by fairness of the accommodation. These factors added up to whether the co-workers thought the accommodation arrangements were fair, and that determined their level of support or not. So returning back to my report on what the workplace managers were thinking, what they told me was that in situations where it's not straightforward and there's an invisible injury or things are not known, they actually rely on the rumour mill for the co-workers to be able to understand the worker's condition. They are constrained by privacy and confidentiality requirements, and so they leave it to the co-workers. They hope and sometimes counsel the returning injured worker to disclose what's happening, but they don't say. They also generally left it up to the workers to redistribute their duties. In some workplaces, co-workers were directly told, okay, you will need to do whatever aspects of the normal duties that the returning worker can't do because of their functional limitations, but in many workplaces it was just left up to them to sort it out. Other times too, because the managers felt constrained in what they could say but wanted to give some information, they might do some in-service training on mental health conditions and wellness and understanding mental disorders and the impact in the workplace and what needs to happen to help people manage in such situations in the workplace. They might provide training on anti-bullying or remind people of the code of conduct. So they would deliver some generic training in the hope that co-workers would respond accordingly and modify their behaviour to be supportive of the injured worker. So they particularly used these informal processes when they knew they needed to engage social support of the co-workers. They did this when they anticipated return to work not being straightforward. So although managers were viewing this from their administrative stance, they see the formal process, unconsciously they actually know that this is about managing social interactions, because it was in these difficult social situations that they had to use these backdoor means to circumvent barriers to communication, and that they knew that something had to happen because there were these psychosocial barriers. So they might be emotional responses by the injured worker. They might have anxiety or depression, or it's these pre-injury conflicts or that type of condition. They were unconsciously aware that they were having to create a line of communication indirectly with the injured worker to try to manage these social context issues. And as I flagged before, they also had difficulty integrating return to work with other legal requirements. So, and this is because the formal return to work procedures only address functional needs, as if this were a simple mechanistic process of a person coming back to a workplace somehow in isolation, although it's the isolation that can be or could be a negative thing, getting on with these accommodations. And they had no scope for dealing with these social interactions or HR issues. And so they were really describing this lack of fit between return to work and other requirements, and a real fear of doing the wrong thing. They felt that tension between performance issues and having to set these aside while they dealt with the return to work process. And the reality is there is no choice about that. But managers had difficulty because sometimes they had experienced the not uncommon situation that in beginning to attempt to address a performance issue, an injured worker had felt stressed, gone to their medical practitioner and made a claim for workers' compensation for psychological injury. So so these were challenges, and it was quite difficult for managers, that they were saying, when it comes to trying to turn a blind eye to these things, knowing that this has been a person whose performance was marginal, but they now cannot address that and in fact have to give them favourable conditions. Okay, so at the end of this this focus group or the interviews that I was doing, it was an interesting shift, and so we came to the point of asking the managers what they thought about this from the co-worker's perspective. And at that point it was if they could, they changed lenses. They changed the lens of looking at this as a manager who is trying to meet their requirements to get this person back to work, to how it might be for the co-workers. And they recognise that it's difficult when accommodations will allow the injured worker to work in a desired area, and that other people will lose that opportunity. And one manager said, you know, sometimes people will be working on a production line 20 or 30 years waiting to get to a particular nice place in the sun type role, but this type of role is now what's given to injured workers. I've certainly been in factory situations where I've observed that people who would otherwise work in quite challenging conditions might get to then work in a pleasantly air-conditioned office doing some duties, you know, testing samples or working in some quality assurance role because it involves light work. That is a duty that other people would desire, and now they can't do it. It's also difficult when, you know, people are getting paid for less work or productivity, when people are allowed to leave early, sit when others are standing, have different opportunities to other people who are getting the same pay. So really any conditions under which the situation ends up being inequitable or it feels unfair. And so managers said things like, well, it's only human that I guess that co-workers might react the way they do. And then there was this overall sense that it was unfairness that drove the lack of support. And I showed you that previous figure where our research found that indeed it was a range of factors, and it was whether the co-worker evaluated this situation as being fair or not that determined what the level of support was. Again, going back to theory, and this goes even back to philosophy on the what leads to perceptions of fairness. And fairness comes out of perceptions of just, whether something is just or not. So it's based on two components, and the first of those is distributed justice. And this is whether there is an equal distribution of rewards and resources. So in the workplace, you know, do I get the same pay for the same work? Do I get more pay? Do I have to take more responsibility? Do I have to bear a bit more heat? Do I have to work longer hours, take things home? If I'm getting more pay for that, or there's some benefit to me, then that might be okay. But overall, employees expect that there will be equal distribution. Whether a co-worker will judge something as distributively fair depends on the sense of equity, but also needs. So in some situations, and this is based on the norm to be kind, that injured workers may be prepared to tolerate inequity because of a sense of an overall justice in a situation. But what we also found, though, that this was balanced by that sense of procedural justice. If usually procedural justice comes from having accurate information, being able to provide input or have some control, but in workplace situations, if the co-workers know that there are excellent HR policies, that everything is done according to how it ought to be, that this entitlement of this particular injured worker will apply to them in the unhappy situation that they had a workplace injury, then that can cause them to tolerate distributive injustice. But it's a balance. If there isn't a sense of procedural justice and there is inequity, and this particular person doesn't seem worthy of that norm to be kind, then co-workers are going to perceive it to be unfair, and ultimately there will be a lack of support, which again we know leads to poor outcomes. So what to do about this? The further conversation that we had with managers, and again, just going back to the managing of workplace health and safety, we know that risk management is based on communication, cooperation and coordination. And these are the steps. We have hazard identification. So what we have to do is we have to recognise straight up a situation that has potential for harm. So I would propose and have proposed that when there are psychosocial situations, and managers know this, these do not come by surprise. If they know this injured worker and they know the context, they know when there is a risk, and the risk will be because of that social context of work. So there needs to be an assessment done. In normal circumstances, if we've identified a hazard, we do a risk assessment. So we understand that by consultation, we ask the people at the coalface what the problem is, what they see the risk as. Then we institute a risk control process. Again, we ask the people at the coalface, how can we minimise this risk? How can we minimise this hazard? And we know that we may have understandings about, technical things, about, safe weights to lift or whatever, but use of assistive devices or personal protection equipment. But the people who do the job are the people who really know. So we get input from that. We devise a management plan and then review it as to, when we review that with all the parties involved to work out how it's going. So what I can tell you is I have since done a study, and actually here at my own workplace, where we had a hazard involved in an injured worker coming back who was unpopular. A long-term employee, some level of respect, um, liked in some contexts outside the workplace. Generally, her workplace behaviours were disapproved and not liked by co-workers. But we agreed to do this pilot, and she agreed to us going through this process. So a hazard was identified in getting this person successfully back to work and in causing distress to other co-workers and some risk to the workplace as well. So individually, co-workers were involved in a conversation process. Where we started though was from the position, it is a requirement that we assist this person to get back to work and to have that opportunity. You know, if this were you, the same would happen. So that's our bottom line. We have to do that. This process is to help you be involved in working in us understanding what are the issues here. So we were doing a risk assessment. Then what can we do to manage this? And we came up with a plan, and which has 2 years down the track worked out very successfully. And in that process, one of the strategies was that the injured worker went to counselling. The injured worker was told about her contributions to some conflict, and this person was willing to do what she needed to do to help this work out as well. So perhaps some of you are out there thinking, oh, maybe this wouldn't work in our particular situation with a particular person. This was a pretty prickly situation, and it took quite a while, but it was having that shared and common goal and realising that it was only going to be through communication, collaboration, cooperation, and each person doing their bit that this was going to work out, and the process was progressively reviewed and a good outcome was achieved. So what have I concluded, and what do I now advocate? That current return to work has been shaped by the requirements largely for musculoskeletal injuries, and it's involved a layering of legislations. Workers' compensation legislation first came in the 1920s, and really it involved there wasn't this return to work process. People were given compensation, a monetary remedy for the damage that had been that they'd sustained. But as time has gone by, in the 1980s we got anti-discrimination legislation, which allowed for accommodations of disabled people in the workplace, and this came to include injured workers, not people with traditional accommodations. Then in the 2000s we got privacy and confidentiality legislation, which has constrained us from speaking about in ways that would normally we would normally manage hazards. So we've had a layering upon the workers' compensation process that has led to this situation where the managers described a fear of what to do and fear of doing the wrong thing, but this awkward fit of not being able to manage a situation in the way that they know work best, and so therefore using these backdoor informal processes. So my current encouragement is that we need at the least some injured workers to be able to disclose the nature of their invisible injury, and beyond that to use standard risk management strategies for dealing with the the risk of a poor return to work outcome when we know that it's going to be this perception of unfairness that's going to prohibit the successful return to work process. As I mentioned, there are a number of studies that I've written up there, and within those references you will be able to find reference to the materials that I've presented in this presentation. And as a supplement to this material, I'll be sending through links to all of these as well. So that is the end of the presentation for now. So I'm happy to now go over to questions.
All right, thanks, Deborah. So if you have any questions at this time, please type them into the questions box in the Go to Webinar section. We have a few questions that came in. One of the questions was, what happened with the IW does not want to disclose to coworkers what their illness or injury is?
Well, then we remain in that stuck situation. There's nothing that we can't force the injured worker to do that. But what I would propose is that somebody counsels this person that it may go best, because what we know is that if people understand, if people can make sense of a situation, then you're going to get their buy-in much better than if they don't. But under the legislative requirements that we have, we cannot force an injured worker to disclose. But sometimes I will say to them, this is going to have to be a give and take process. And so we're going to have to require people to give in various ways. And if you can give by letting them have some information, then experience tells me that's going to make it work better for you and everyone else.
Okay. Another question is, if you are a manager in a return to work situation, where can you go to find resources to assist this process?
Most workers' compensation authorities I'm aware of your Canadian provinces, and certainly here in Australia, have quite a large amount of resources. Usually, certainly in Australia, we call it injury management. Perhaps in Canada you call it work reintegration management, but and even if you have to resort to some Australian sites, WorkSafe Australia, there's quite a lot of resources there that can talk through a number of these processes that I've talked about, and that in that early return to work is where they tend to mention ways to engage social processes, but that stops then. As soon as the injured worker steps back into the workplace, it's like we're turning off that social awareness context. But I would say from any of the provincial or state workers' compensation authorities usually have pretty good resources if you go to their website.
Okay, and we can link those to our site following the webinar as well. Another question is, have you found any gender differences in the workers' perception of the effectiveness of the return to work process?
No. I'm thinking that maybe sometimes people will think that females might be more compassionate or caring. But when I showed you that diagram, they'll come up for me, attributes of the co-worker, we looked at gender issues here as well, and none of those things made a difference, because what we found is that females and males will be equally supportive if they think it's fair, and it all comes up to this fairness. If they think it's fair, but there can be some really nice, kind, caring, supportive behaviour from males. If we're going to think of gender stereotypes, but certainly there can be some at least verbally aggressive and unsupportive behaviours from females.
Great. Another question is, do you have suggestions for managers to encourage coworkers to be more supportive thinking in a constructive environment other than falling on workplace formal workplace policies?
Yes, I do. I think as I said in one of these later slides, engage them in the conversation. Probably most managers have dealt with a physical hazard or even a psychological hazard, but most people want to do a good job. Most people are fair and reasonable. Most people, if you give them an understanding of what the challenges are and you give them a voice, again in the particular case study that I was doing, I told the people involved that what they wanted to say to me would be confidential. So I let them ventilate, and this person's been awful, and she's said this to me, and she's done that, and she's this and that, and simply acknowledging that and acknowledging, yeah, I can hear what you're saying. I understand that that's been really difficult for you, and I'm sorry that you had to experience that from this person. But we have to help this person get back to work. What do you think might be a solution? So my answer to that in question is being able to engage them in a conversation about how, and giving them a voice about how this might work and how this might work, be able to be workable for them.
Okay, oh, I might have read that last question wrong. I think they were looking for if you had evaluated any construction worker environments in your research.
Oh, construction work environment. Some of the managers were from, one of the managers was from a construction site, yes. So, sorry, can you give me the first part of that question again so I can...
Yeah, sure. Do you have any suggestions for managers to encourage coworkers, particularly in a construction environment?
In a construction. I guess my answer is the same. It's having the conversation. We know that risks are managed by communication to get cooperation, and you've got a risk when you've got a difficult situation. And I know from my work in managing hazards in other contexts that if you give people a voice, it's amazing, rather than just telling them how it's going to be, the different level of cooperation that you can get. That is my best suggestion.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions for now. Do you have anything you'd like to add now that we're ending the webinar?
I think I've said it all, but I'm always happy for people to email me if they think there might be something I could help them with, or information that I can supply. You simply Google my name, you'll find my address, but I'm also happy to send that in to be part of the documents that are on the website.
Great. Thank you, Deborah.